when the Lord speaks to you, when you're in your quiet time or you're sitting in service and you know that word was for you, whoever was up here speaking, and you know, man, that nailed me. God was speaking directly to me. It was more than for the moment. If you've been around here for even just a few years, you know that we love Christmas around here, love to get into this story. 22 years ago or so, when I became the pastor of this church, excuse me, the Christmas story gripped me. And the Lord began to speak to me about how Christmas, when the Lord operates, He operates in patterns. There are templates, it's known, another way to say it is the ways of God. It's when God told Moses, I will show you my ways. When David cried out, Lord, show me your ways in Psalm 25. So there are ways of the Lord. And when you know His ways, you can get in the way. You can intercept Him. You can understand the ways of the Lord, and you can cooperate as He operates. And so it's an important aspect. It's like any relationship. I know my wife's ways. The longer I'm with her, the more I understand her. It's been 35 years of intense study. Well, 35 years of marriage. We were engaged for a couple of years. It took me a while. I needed to get moving. I over spiritualized it. I was waiting for stone tablets in the mail, and then finally I realized I just need to marry this girl. But I had to know her ways. I had to learn how she operates, and so that we have a more intimate relationship. And the same is true of God. God has ways, and that's one of the reasons He gave us His book. Because God operates in patterns. There are certain ways in which God works. Matter of fact, it says in the New Testament, 2 different passages, it alludes to the fact that God, the things that happened to the men of old were for instruction to us. So that we see how God interacted with man in the Old Testament, so we can position ourselves to interact with Him in the same way, that God has His ways. And the Christmas story is a beautiful example of this very thing. It was a picture of God's original invasion, where heaven came to earth. Literally, in human form, Jesus invaded human history. That is the Christmas story. And it really is a template for revival. Even as we worship, there's this heart cry begins to rise from within us. Oh, Jesus, come. Come. And someone could say, well, you already did. Yeah, but we want Him to come again and again and again. We want Him to come. We want our hunger to rise to the extent that there is, as God pours out His Spirit, as He comes in His Spirit, our cry is such that He says, the only way I can answer this one is to come in person, crack the eastern sky, and return. And that's where we want to live. We want Him to come. And the Christmas story gives us markers or patterns by which God moves in human history. And so we can look at how all the characters interacted and they moved, and how God visited these and all these different interconnected parts, and we can get hints on how God moves in our own personal lives and how He moves in human history in general. When you read the Christmas story, one of the things that you end up coming away with is that God is always operating on multiple fronts simultaneously. We have a tendency to think, well, God's working in me, or God's working in them and not in me, but God is always working on multiple fronts, multiple generations, multiple vocations. There's people, and our lives are intertwined, and they intersect as God is moving and doing His work in the earth. And you see this in the Christmas story. A woman and her husband, Zechariah. Zechariah was a priest. He goes in to offer the incense, and he has this angelic encounter. We're not going to get into this morning, but I just want to touch on Zechariah and Elizabeth. It's a great story. And the angel says to Zechariah, encounters him, and he's stunned. This angel appears to him, and he said, your prayers have been heard. Now, this couple was well beyond childbearing years. She'd been through menopause, he'd been through menopause, and they were done. Those prayers that they had ascended to heaven long ago, there was one of two things going on. Either they had the faith to keep praying well beyond their childbearing years, or more likely, the angel was referring to the prayers they once prayed. that those words never hit the ground. And now was the time for God to answer that prayer. And the angel said, your wife will be with child. And so here was Elizabeth. She was carrying this child. And then, it was 6 months later, another young woman has, her cousin, a young teenage girl, has a visitation by an angel. And she's told, you're going to be with child. And so you see this generational thing going on that it first hit the elderly generation before the younger generation. What the older generation would carry would pave the way for what the younger generation carried. Literally, John was a preparer of the way. And in a very real sense, Elizabeth was preparing the way for Mary. And what she carried would prepare the way for what Mary carried. And it's this beautiful picture of God moving on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, we have wise men over in Persia. They're seeking God. They don't even really have a relationship with the real God, the Most High God, but they have these manuscripts left by Daniel, and they're looking through this, and they're discerning that, hey, this is a unique moment in human history. And so the little light that they had in the form of a star and revelation from the manuscripts, they make their way, and so God's moving among them, and they end up funding the way for Joseph and Mary and Jesus to get to Egypt, to avoid Herod and his death sentence on young Jesus. And so all these things are happening at once. And then you have the shepherds. Same thing. They have this angelic encounter. So one of the takeaways from this is you can look at that when God is about to move on planet Earth, there is an uptick of the supernatural. Now, I believe that we are to be naturally supernatural. It's to be a lifestyle. We're to hear from God and so forth. But there was an uptick of supernatural activity in the form of angelic intervention. And that's not a coincidence, because God was about ready to do something. And when we read these stories, and frankly, when we read biographies, I'm a big fan. I've got shelves full of biographies of great men and women of God, and I love. I was just sharing with Andy and Melissa this morning, I'm going through John Wimber's life. Connie Dawson, the book's John Wimber by Connie Dawson. Read it, it's awesome. And I've just been so challenged by this book and just the journey God took John Wimber through. And I love reading biographies because, again, we see the patterns of heaven, the ways God deals with one. It can give us indications of how we can engage God in our own life and all of that. But here's one of the dangers. When we read these stories or we read the books of great men and women of God, the danger is we read the highlight reel. We're looking at the magnificent peak experiences and the really low valley experiences. And then when we compare the mundane plain living of our lives, we seem to feel like we live on a plateau so often, we can, if we're not careful, inadvertently disqualify ourselves thinking, well, I guess God doesn't want to use me like he uses other people because I don't have all these multiple mountaintop experiences. When in reality, we're reading the condensed version. We're, within 200, 300 pages, we're reading 40, 50 years of living. And we tend to think that it's all compressed. You read the life of Abraham and these amazing encounters he has with God. And then there's decades of silence. Now, I don't believe we need to put up with decades of silence. I'm not encouraging that, okay? Matter of fact, I want to stir your hunger. I don't want to placate your apathy. I want to stir your hunger this morning that God wants to intervene in your life, but we need to understand the real, what sets those who God can really use apart from those who end up being sidelined is the way they steward the plains between the mountain peaks. What do you do with those encounters? Many of you have seen it. I've been at this for a while, and I've seen people powerfully touched by the Lord. We've had waves of revival blow through the church, and I've seen people get powerfully touched, physically healed and emotionally healed and empowered, where the Spirit of God comes on them and pins them to the ground. They get up and spiritual gifts break loose in their life in a fresh way. And then you look back in a few years and they're not even walking with the Lord. Or maybe they're still walking with the Lord, but it's like the fire's died down. I've had people come to me and say, Pastor, I don't know how you guys do this, keeping the fire burning after all these years, man. I had a young woman tell me, she said, I have promises God gave me 6 months ago, and he still hasn't fulfilled them. He said, I hear you talk about words you gave you 20 years ago. How do you keep that fire burning? And that's a great question, because we're responsible to steward or pastor our own heart. We've got to learn to, David learned the skill set of encouraging himself in the Lord. That's a powerful thing. I was talking to I do a Bible study, the Young Bucks Bible study, and we were talking the other day about how, Scripture says, encourage one, as long as it is called today, I believe it's Hebrews 6, as long as it is called today, encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that you may not be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. There's a whole lot packed into that little exhortation. What he's saying is this. He's saying, listen, as long as it is called today, as long as you're in time and not in eternity. Anybody in today? Okay, if you're still breathing, you're in today. As long as you're still breathing, then encourage one another daily. Why? Because it's a guard against the sin hardening our heart, and the deceitfulness of sin sabotaging us. In other words, when we are discouraged, he said, encourage your one another today, because that's going to be the safeguard against being enticed by sin. When you are discouraged, it's very easy to be pulled into sin. It's easier to justify compromise when you are discouraged. And when we understand that, in the context we were talking about this, is the Bible is the ultimate psychological manual. God is the great psychologist, designed the human soul, and then leaves clues for us in the Bible on how to steward our own heart. And what I'm going to get into this morning is how Mary was one such woman. She learned how to steward her own heart during the lean times so that God could greatly use her, unlike anybody else in all of human history. And you and I need to learn that skill set of, number one, encouraging each other, looking all around all the time. But when we come in this room on Sunday morning, we need to have our eyes open, and we need to be looking for some people to encourage. And some of you are very good at that. And some others, we need to learn to do that better. But some of you, it's that sense that you have. You go around and you make those small deposits. It might be just a word of encouragement, something you've observed in their life. It might be that hug that you give them, or that prophetic word that, man, I was praying for you this week. Bill Culver's very good at that. I've got cards in my desk. I don't know how he prints so small, but just tiny little print, and these encouragements, and I keep those things because I might need to pull one back out and remind myself. And what that does is I'm helping somebody else guard themselves from being seduced by sin's deceitfulness. Sin is very deceptive. And you're more prone to give into its deception when you are discouraged. So that's why when we least want to be around people is when we most need to be around people. When you least want to be to church is when you most need to be here. But there's a step beyond us encouraging one another, and that is learning to pastor our own heart and encourage ourselves in the Lord. Now, we'll never outgrow the need to be encouraged by others, because they're going to bring a perspective that we need in those times. But the fact is, we also need to learn to encourage ourselves, to pastor your own heart. How do you keep that fire burning on the altar of your heart? The fire on the altar must never go out. And you are responsible to steward your own passion, your own flame for God. And so we need to learn how to do that. That's a skill set that's developed over time, and it's unique to you and it's unique to me. There are certain things that are going to stoke your fire that won't stoke mine. And we just need to understand ourselves and learn to encourage ourselves in the Lord. And in fact, I've found, maybe I'm just weird, but I have found for me personally that there are seasons where one thing will stoke the fire on my heart, and I can wear that thing out. You ever had a song that really just moves you? I'm notorious for wearing that song out to the point where I don't even like it anymore. It's like, I can't stand that song because I just wore it out. If it was a cassette tape, it kind of, I stretched the tape. But if that thing is going to feed me, I'm going to wear that thing out. And I've learned this. I was thinking about this the other day. There is something about people of the Word. I'm not talking about people that every now and then have an insight. I'm talking about people who have learned, week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. They have been people in the Word and handle the Word, and they're not reaching into some moldy manna from yesterday, but they're in the Word and they've learned to draw from that thing. And the wonderful thing about the Word is, I remember when I first got saved, I'd look at it and think, how am I ever going to figure this book out? This thing's massive. And I hear these guys talking about, this is the kind of helmet the Hittites wore. And where am I going to find that stuff? I don't know that, And I'd look at that and be so overwhelmed. But the fact is, the more you study, the more you know. It multiplies. You're not just adding. It will multiply in all these tributaries. And the people that I know that are in the Word, they are strong in spirit. There's a stability and an authority they begin to walk in. And so what we're going to talk about this morning, if I get to it, we're going to talk about how Mary and all these supernatural encounters surrounding Jesus' birth, but there were some people that stewarded them right and were greatly used of the Lord, and others who they were amazed and moved on. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be a part of that company of people that were amazed and moved on. I don't want to just look back, I had this experience, this encounter, this thing happened, but it didn't really change my life. And one of the markers of those people is we learn to be people of the Word, to establish these things in the Word. I just want to encourage you, let 2025, as we're going into the new year, let this be a year where you begin to learn to establish the pattern, the habit of being a man or woman of the Word. And the more you read, the more you're going to know, and the more you're going to discover you don't know, and there'll be an awakened appetite within you. I have found that if I get out of the Word for a couple days, my appetite will greatly diminish for it. But if I will stay in the Word, I just want more, because it is such a fascinating book. It holds the secrets to life. So let's read here. Where did I tell you to turn to? Luke 2? Yeah, let's look at this. Look at verse 15. The backstory here is Mary has already given birth to Jesus. Joseph's had an encounter where he was going to quietly divorce this girl he was betrothed to, because in that era, if you were betrothed, which was a heavy-duty engagement, the only way to break that was through divorce. And he was going to do it quietly because she was found, the Bible so eloquently says she was found to be with child. And so he was very disillusioned. He's going to break up there. An angel encounters him in a dream and says, hey, this is of me. And all these supernatural activities which created Jesus' entrance into human history. And now there's some shepherds out in the field. We don't have time to get into that. It's a fascinating passage. But we pick it up in verse 15. Listen to what it says. When the angels went away from them into heaven. So the angels, they're out in the dark field, all by themselves. The sheep, the fire's low, it's dark, and all of a sudden it says, the whole sky lit up, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them. And an angel began to speak to them. And then on the backside of that, there was a whole choir shows up. I mean, this is an amazing experience. And all of a sudden, they're gone. And they're all looking at each other. Did this really happen? Oh my goodness. And it's an amazing thing that God chose these normal shepherds to give this tremendous revelation to. And if you look at it, we don't have time to get into it, but I want to encourage you, go home and look at this. The way the angel interacted, it's almost as if it was just random. It was almost as if the angel was so excited about what he was seeing. He's like, I can't believe this. There's been all this activity in heaven. I've been wondering what's going on, and now it's here. This is amazing. And he just pops in and said, hey guys, I just got to share this with you. And they're like terrified. And he tells them, unto you has been born a child. And they're like, we didn't even know we were pregnant. They're just freaking out, trying to figure out what they're saying. And then the angel leaves. And then what happens? It says, when the angel went away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let us go over to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. He said, let's go. They said, let's go. Angelic encounters are for movement and not mere excitement. When God's presence breaks into your quiet time in a unique way, or a prophet calls you out in the middle of a service, or whatever way in which God encounters you in a unique way. I mean, just like Jace was saying, there's week after week, there's the normalcy of the Christian life, and I don't want to minimize that. It's an amazing Christian life, but there are times where God breaks in special ways. There's always a purpose behind that. And it's incumbent upon us to lean in and say, God, what do you want me to do with this? Because the danger is they just become a story in our spiritual journey. It's a goosebump moment we refer to. Oh, you should have been in this one service. Well, I would propose to you that when God breaks in, it's not so much for the moment, but what he's wanting to do with that break-in in the ensuing days. And we need to understand that, because otherwise we squander those break-ins of heaven. We don't really take advantage of what God's doing. When the Lord speaks to you, when you're in your quiet time or you're sitting in service and you know that word was for you, whoever was up here speaking, and you know, man, that nailed me. God was speaking directly to me. It was more than for the moment. There is that element of those things where it's the kiss from heaven and God's just letting you know, I didn't lose your address. I still have your phone number. And that's glorious. But there's more to it than that. And so when there was a dramatic supernatural encounter, they were determined to act on what was revealed. So it says, and they went with, verse 16, and they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in a manger. And when they saw it, they made known to them the saying that had been told them concerning the child. And all who heard it wondered at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen as it was told to them. So they said, let's go and see this thing. Revelation needs to lead to experience. And what was shown us in principle must be lived out in the practical, or it's lost. The charismatic experience, the charismatic movement, charismatic phenomena. There's the Word and there's the Spirit. And we don't have to choose. In fact, if we do choose, we end up imbalanced. We need to be men and women of the Word and of the Spirit simultaneously. And in fact, what will happen is God will work in two ways in your life. He will show you something in His Word, and then He'll bring you experientially into that truth. Or you'll have an encounter, you'll have an experience, and then over time He'll unpack what He did there in His Word. And if you get farther in the Word than you are in the Spirit, or farther in the Spirit than you are in the Word, you become imbalanced. And so we need to be men and women of the Word and the Spirit. And God desires that we do so. And so these shepherds had this angelic encounter. What did they do? They said, let's go see this thing. Let's act on this. Let's go see what's going on. Let's pursue this thing and not be satisfied that we had an encounter out at night. Now let's go to bed and let's think what we'll do. No, they immediately said, let's go search for this thing that God has spoken to us about. And I just want to encourage you this morning. I want to provoke you that when God begins to move in your life, understand it's more than just the momentary experience. He has initiated something that if you will pull on that thing, it's going to begin to unfold. I just became acquainted with a guy named Chris Berglund, fascinating guy. I'm gonna have him come in and speak sometime. But Chris, I've heard of him for many years. Lou Engle refers to him as his personal prophet. So a lot of times, Lou has built his ministry on these prophetic objectives that God will give him, and then he'll go and do them, these gatherings on the mall and all these things that Lou has done all these years. But a lot of them have come through his friend Chris. Chris is a dreamer. And it's just fascinating. I was down in Burlington with him recently. And when he goes in a place, he tends to have dreams about that place. And that's exactly what happened. So the first meeting, the guy who knew him said, "Chris, did you have any dreams last night?" He said, "Yeah." And he began to talk about, he had a dream about Old Zion. He said there was a place, Old Zion. And there was all this symbolism. And one of the people from Burlington speaks up and said, "Well, that's 2 blocks away." It was the first church in Iowa. And it was the proxy government until the government was established as the capital in Burlington, then went to Iowa City and then to Des Moines. And the whole objective of these meetings was about governing at the gate. And so there's just all this symbol. I thought it was fascinating. I said, "Chris, I'm going to have you come in. You don't even have to preach. We'll pay you to come and take a nap and just dream and then let me know what you get," because it was just amazing. But what's really fascinating to me about this guy is that, so we've been just texting back and forth, a small group of us. And for Chris, it's not just he gets a dream, but he's unpacking those and praying about those and submitting that to a group of people, and everybody's giving input, and there's more that comes out of those things. And I think a lot of times God will give us a seed and we'll end up a 30-fold hearer when there's 60 and 100-fold potential. But because we so quickly move on, we just look at that, that was an experience, that was an event, and let's move on, rather than, "Lord, what are you saying?" And beginning to ask the Lord and pray into those things, and the Lord wants to begin to give us more. That's true of the Word of God when you're studying. Some of you have heard me say this before, but it was a number of years ago now. I was preaching on the soils of Matthew 13. And the Lord spoke to me and he said, "There are people sitting in the chairs at Heartland that get more out of your messages than you do." And it wasn't an encouragement. It wasn't a commendation. It was a rebuke. He was correcting me as a son and saying, "Listen, you're in such a hurry to get to the next week to preach again that you fail to realize I'm trying to speak to you about what you preached on last week." There's always a danger. Those of you that are called to preach and teach, I just want to caution you that there's such a danger to us studying so we can preach rather than studying so God can transform us and change us, and then out of the overflow we can just share with others. But it's a tragedy that God will give us something, we'll share it, and someone else is getting more out of it than we are because we're moving on to the next thing. And so there's more in these things that if we'll just pause and say, "God, what's in here?" And this passage, that is what Mary did. It's interesting. It says that the crowd around, because the shepherds began to tell everybody. They made known what the Lord had shown to them. They acted on the word of the Lord. They went and they wanted to see it. They delivered the word of the Lord to Mary and Joseph, and that was one of the primary purposes, is because Mary and Joseph needed to be strengthened by God breaking into this thing. And sometimes other people need to hear what God is showing you. They need to hear because it's going to encourage them in their walk. A lot of times it ain't about us. Now, we'll get some in the process. It's like when Jesus uses your boat, you get a boatload in the process. That's great. But the real thing is that he wants to use us to help others. And so they hightailed it over. They gave it to Mary and Joseph. And it said that people were amazed at what these men said. They were so intrigued because the genuineness, the fact that these guys were being honest about, they were obviously transformed. And people were amazed. But it says Mary, and it juxtaposes these two different responses. Some were amazed, but Mary treasured them and pondered them in her heart. And the idea is that Mary, or the others were amazed. It was like an event. Wow, that was cool. And then they move on. But Mary took that and said, listen, I want to make this a fixture in my life. I want to get everything I can out of this. I'm going to ponder this. When it says she treasured, both of the words in the Greek have the idea of taking what was previous and adding it to what was, taking what you're getting in the moment and adding it to what was previous. So it has the prefix, I want to say it was the prefix, not the suffix, for together. It's been a long time since I looked up those words, so I can't tell you. But it's this idea of she treasured them, so it meant the first word treasured meant to guard together. And so she took that and she guards this. This is precious to me. But not only is this thing, I'm going to add it to everything else because God's filling out a picture for me and I'm beginning to realize what he's doing. So I'm going to continue to take this stuff in and I'm going to guard this word. I'm not going to let it go. I'm going to make sure I keep hold of this thing. You know, as I was meditating on this, I want to commend Pastor Adam. Because there has been a number of times in the last 6 months where Adam will remind me of something that I shared with him that the Lord told me. And it's challenged me. I've never told him this, but it challenged me because it was like, whoa, he's remembering this. And God gave that to me, but he's remembering it more than I am. And we need to treasure those things. I write stuff down all the time, and I'll go through those files to remind myself. But it's easy if we're not careful to let that stuff go by the wayside. And we need to guard those words because those words were given to us for a reason. And what I'm saying is this. Listen, if you get nothing else out of this morning, take this away. When God speaks to you, when he visits you, in whatever form or fashion that happens, every encounter that you have with God, whether it's him opening up a verse to a prophetic word, to his presence coming on you in private or corporately, all of that, it's for more than the moment. There's something being deposited to you, and if you're not careful, you can be like the crowds. They were amazed. Wow, that was amazing. And then they forget about it. Or you're like Mary. Now, previously, Mary had had her own encounter with an angel. And the angel came to her, and he said, you are highly favored among women. And it says she was troubled by this. She didn't see herself that way. She was trying to kind of adjust the way she identified with what God was saying about her. And that was one of the primary reasons that angel said that. He's trying to tweak her and bring her into alignment with what God was saying about her. And then he said, you have found favor. He says it twice. You are highly favored, you have found favor, and you will be with child. Begs the question, why was she favored? Apart from all, what distinguished her from all these other girls that God could have used for this purpose? You know, people talk about a sovereign move of God. I don't believe any move is completely sovereign. It may have been sovereign in the sense that God in his heart decided that was going to happen, but then he has to engage someone on the earth. So there's a divine side to a move of God, and there's a human side to a move of God. There's a divine side to this equation. God is looking for someone to favor, but then there has to be somebody that can be favored. Let me just push on that a little bit. We talked about this a number of months ago. In Hebrews chapter 11, it talks about God identifies, self-identifies. He said, I am the rewarder of them that diligently seek me. What that insinuates is that there is something on the human side that God will respond to. And we tend to think of, God just arbitrarily, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a believer by the toe, bless them as they go, But that's not how it happens. There's something about, what I'm saying is there are heart postures, heart attitudes, behaviors that we can adopt that actually attract the attention of God. Cornelius was a Roman centurion. He's praying and an angel shows up, an angelic visitation. An angel appears to him and he says, your prayers and your alms have caused you to come before the face of God. Guy's not even a believer yet, but he has an angelic encounter. He said, send for a man named Peter at the tanner's house. He'll come and he's gonna unpack this for you. And this guy was not even a believer yet, but he was searching for the living God. And he was doing what he knew to do according to the Jewish customs, because he was a Roman centurion that knew the Jewish believers. And he was giving to the poor. And those behaviors, it's very explicit in the passage, those behaviors caused him to come before the attention of God. Now, some of us don't tend to think that way. What I'm saying is there are certain attitudes, postures of your heart, and even behaviors that can garner the attention of heaven. This isn't works. This isn't, I've earned that. No, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there are postures of the human heart that God says, I'm attracted to that heart. And I'm going to bestow favor on them. Favor literally means that you're given a privilege that others don't. That's an amazing thing. I want to be of the tribe of the favorites. You know, what tribe are you? I'm the favorites, you know. And there's a sense in which we are all God's favorite because we're all unique. And I'm his favorite pastor on the platform right now. And I need to revel in that, you know, and there's a sense in which that's true of all of us, but there are qualities that if we respond to the grace of God, that will cause us to be able to be favored, to be blessable, if you will. We talk about want to be blessed, we'll be blessable. Make sure your behavior, your heart attitude, the way you carry yourself before God is blessable. But what I'm saying is this, I think one of the reasons that she was highly favored was what shows up later on when the shepherds come and tell her what happened. It says she treasured this and she pondered this. Treasured means I'm going to guard it together with all the other words and experiences and all this crazy phenomena that's been swirling around us. My boyfriend stayed with me when I was found to be pregnant. I can't even explain this thing and all this is happening. And then it says she pondered it. And that has the idea of meditating on it. It's not that just, I'm going to write it down and treasure. I'm going to make sure I keep this. But she also kept meditating on it. She kept processing it. She was thinking about what the Lord was saying to her. She was trying to unpack and connect the dots. Well, he said this and he said this and God worked this way in the Old Testament. And there are these verses in the Old Testament that talk about a Messiah and a virgin shall be found with child. And she's starting to connect the dots. She's pondering those things. And I believe personally that that's one of the reasons she found favor, because God found a girl that had developed those habits in her relationship with God. It's not a matter of her earning that. It's just that God is looking for people who are responding to his patterns. Are you a person of the word? It will bring favor on your life. Because just the fact of you're in the word, you're going to see things. Your life is going to work better because you're checking into the owner's manual. God can correct you. You're seeing things. Oh, this is it. And there's something about getting in the word and allowing the Lord to just tenderize your heart. And man, there's something about that. And that makes us blessable, grants favor with God. There are things you can do to attract the favor of heaven. And if we're not careful, we can get locked into this mindset that God is arbitrary. And so there's nothing we can do. It's all by grace. It is by grace. But we can respond to that grace with grace. The grace of God in me can respond to the grace of God coming to me. You know, the development of the word grace over time. There was a long period of time, that word charis, where we get charismatic. Charis, that word is grace. And over time, it meant attraction. It meant a gift given to meet a need. But over time, it finally took on the meaning of gratitude for the gift given. We just had Thanksgiving. What do? Let's pray over the turkey. Let's say grace. And the expression of grace from us, gratitude, actually opens up the opportunity to receive more grace. And so me responding to the grace of God can attract favor from heaven and allow me to be blessed in a greater way. My point is this. When God speaks to you, when he shows you something, when you have an experience, when you're in worship and you feel his presence, understand there's more going on than the momentary experience. There's shelf life on that thing. You can begin to extract things out of that and take that and add that to and give it some thought. Ponder it in your heart like Mary did. Take it and add it to all the other things the Lord has shown you and begin to understand his ways. Begin to develop your senses, your spiritual senses, and understand, when God does this, I notice a pattern. When he does this in my life, it's followed up by these things. We begin to understand his ways, ponder those things, treasure those things. Don't be those who are merely amazed. That's amazing that we're amazed. I mean, it really is. That's awesome. But let's be more than amazed. Let's be those who begin to treasure it and ponder it so we can be blessable or people that are highly favored. Because God had to have a girl like that to bring Christ into the world, and he still does. Hey, thanks for watching. At Heartland Church, we love to worship the Lord and we love his word. And we live stream both every Sunday morning. We would love to have you join us. In fact, if you could jump on and subscribe to our YouTube channel, you could make sure that you don't miss any of the services. We'd love to have you join us live or in person every week. See you next time.